Hello, hello, hello. It's RailNatter. Good evening, everyone. You've got an ill Gareth tonight, and we are talking about open access operations. This is one I've wanted to do for a while. It's let's just put it this way. Hello to Martin Gilbert and your team at First Group. I will be treading very carefully on this one because I think this is journalistically important. This is an important part of the railway story. But I also know that those guys are very angry at me at the moment, and I'd rather they didn't then go and email my employers and get very pissy about it. So I'm going to, but also, not just those guys. Hello, by the way. Not just those guys. Lots of people working for those open access operators that I have lots of time for. So I'm not out there. I'm not out here to pillory any individuals. What I am here to do is make as even-handed a case as I can, looking at two documents. Looking firstly at this, which is First Group's own January 2025 document saying why open access operations are good. The political context of this should be laid out very clearly, which is GBR is arriving and the government are quite reasonably being cool on the idea of open access operators running in amongst their kind of state-owned or state-managed services. And to that end, we're also going to be looking at a memo the Times had leaked to it about 2 weeks ago that actually multiple journalists have sent me copies of, which is quite fun. It's fun to have fun things sent to me. And again, I'm going to be treading very carefully on what I share of this, but I will be sharing the whole memo with bits of it redacted, bits that I think are not pertinent to the argument we're making or are specific enough on things like revenue that I don't believe that hiding revenue information is a thing that the railway needs to do, but equally I'm not going to include it because you don't need it and it will minimise how angry people get at me. My intention here is not for people to be angry at me, not for people to threaten my job, but they are to a somewhat tetchy open access operations at First Group at the moment, understandably. And I'm not here necessarily to just say I hate them and they should be gone. I'm going to try and make as even-handed an argument about this as possible and lay out what is in these two documents and sort of analyse it as best we can, knowing everything we know in RailNatter world. So before we press on, I just want to remind everyone that this can only happen because of you lovely Patreon supporters. I don't have advertising. I don't make huge amounts of money of this. This just, the Patreon money just pays for this thing to exist, and pays for the back end fees and costs and things of this nature. So this episode is only available because of you. So thank you very much. Without further ado, everyone, welcome to tonight's RailNatter. As the Intercity 225 fades away, we must start, of course, with the news. And the start of the news we're going to pick up is Murky Depths on Twitter, always worth a follow. I look forward to them transferring to Blue Sky if they haven't already. Silvertown Tunnel has reduced traffic. Oh, whoops. Yeah, it's been interesting watching traffic, and there have been a few people tracing the state of traffic either side of the Silvertown Tunnel, and it's at best made absolutely no difference. So why did we waste all that money on it, and where we could have built better public transport connections across the river? Well, we've built a tunnel, we can repurpose it, can we not?
So I proposed a new plan.
Oh yes, that's right. Thanks Wallace. It's another rail plan with no money behind it because Yorkshire's plan for rail has just been announced. We will be picking through this, of course, in a future RailNatter because I'm fascinated to see what it says. I think it's about 14 billion quid wish list. Probably lots of it good, but I'm interested to see what it proposes because there are, as we've talked about, challenges with doing all this stuff on the existing railway network, which is precisely what I fear they will be proposing. So we're going to look at this in detail soon, I am sure. Yorkshire's plan for rail. This is an interesting one related to high-speed rail or government's pussyfooting around public transport investment. The state takes stake in station. That's right. The Crown Estate has taken a 50% stake in the Euston Station oversight redevelopment that previously was fully held by Lend-Lease. The Crown Estate is sort of a state element. It's sort of the state's property developer, but also kind of sort of not. It's scrappy, but also it's the government kind of trying to find a way to allow it to have its cake and eat it. Just fund the bloody thing and crack on. It's fine. But in a way, you can make the argument this is good. the railway would make sense to be the landlord of redevelopment of railway land. We've bought this at great public expense. The idea of selling it on the cheap to a private developer who then gets the long-term rentier benefit of it is bad, when we could actually use it for affordable homes, lower business rents, things of this nature. But there we are, an interesting point to observe. Meanwhile, elsewhere in politics, we can see what reform can do in local government. So here we have some interesting before and after documentation, looking at the intention of... so it's worth it. Here's Dave Throop, who's a former Environment Agency high up. Half of the... in Lincolnshire, a third of the population, over 200,000 homes, are at risk of flooding. Much of the county is close to sea level, and one of the reform's first actions was to abolish the Flood Scrutiny Committee and amalgamate it with Environment. And what's interesting is what you can see being sliced out here. So the County Council will determine the number of members of the council who will serve on the Get Rid of Flood and Water Management Environment Scrutiny Committee. So they've got rid of some of the democratic elements of it. They've got rid of the voting rights element of it, which is very interesting. They have... got rid of how often it will meet. And so they've got rid of this. They've a load of stuff for the environment thing, and they've just got rid of all of the flood management stuff. So, for example, the development and delivery of the local flood risk management strategy, which is a critical document for anyone who understands water management. The effectiveness of the Lincolnshire Flood Risk and Drainage Management Partnership, delivery of its local leadership role in relation to flood and water management, absolutely critical. This is interestingly related to a PWI conference we had recently. And associated activities. So this is bad news. This is what reform can do in local government. Crackpots come in and can cause extreme damage. This will have direct impacts on the railway, but also more kind of broadly on Lincolnshire. This is bad. What else? Look, double-decker trains could soon operate through the Channel Tunnel. These are the Avelia Horizons, aren't they? The trouble with these is that none of them work, including all the ones currently sat doing nothing in the northern US. I would love them to be working. Alstom, best of luck with that. But my belief is that these are still not working as a train set, which is baffling. But putting that to one side, more on that some other time, I'm sure, if someone's willing to come and have a chat about it. But actually, I know somebody might be willing to come and have a chat on it very soon, which is going to be exciting. I would love for this to work. Talking about double-deckers going through the Channel Tunnel, I would love for this to work, but there are challenges, accessibility and evacuation challenges associated with this in a way that there aren't for other trains. And I would love this to work, because if you could get high capacity, if you get the WeGo levels of capacity on a 400-metre train, that's 1,480 passengers. That is very, very interesting for minimal infrastructure upgrades, but maximal passenger capacity benefits through the Channel Tunnel. So it's a very interesting proposition. I'm not sure it can fully work at this stage, given requirements through the Channel Tunnel, but I would love it to. Next bit of news. The EU plans a €2 fee on small parcels in Hit to Shine and Temu. This is good. I wonder what happens to what the implications are for Amazon. But a €2 flat fee on billions of small parcels sent directly to people's homes, mostly from China at the moment. It's an interesting call. It's kind of like a tariff on China, but equally, I don't know. This is good because, it's extremely bad for the environment that we just are moving all this stuff around for, all this kind of consumer junk around, as well as anything a bit more serious. So anything that kind of consolidates this, for starters, or pushes companies to think about ways that it can consolidate deliveries or encourage bulk deliveries or improve their overall logistics would be good. But this mostly because it's, I think, a customs issue for all the countries that this is happening to, and they don't have the capacity to deal with the customs side of things. So interesting. This is good. I think this is good policy. This is policy that impacts on transport positively. This is also interesting. Finland is intending to switch its entire rail network to standard gauge. This is interesting. So standard gauge rollout is seemingly the preferable option for all of the countries on the Russian frontier at this point. And you know what? Yep, I would agree with that. It is a reasonably good way to prevent Russian military access, is to not let them be able to get trains in, because their logistical core very much relies on rail for movement. So that side of things, but also it's from a trade perspective, not having standard gauge is a massive a drawback on the proper functioning of the railway system. A network works better when it is just that, a network, and standard gauge is an important part of that. The Iberian Peninsula has shown us that you don't need to regauge everything. They have gauge changing trains, but I'm interested to know, in terms of the implications on rolling stock costs versus infrastructure costs, what the actual costs are of a gauge change, because it can be done quite cheaply, relatively speaking. But that's, it's still an absolutely enormous undertaking. So I'm very interested to see how they intend to approach this. No point doing decarb because China is so far behind. Oh, whoops. Yes, the last bit of news is pointing out that China's CO2 emissions are now 1% below their March 2024 peak. So China's greenhouse gas emissions are now going down. That's certainly the trend for the last year, which is very interesting, because we see lots of arguments going, well, there's no point in bothering because China's kicking up so much muck into the atmosphere. Well, that ain't going to fly pretty soon. I expect to see for the next decade this accelerate downwards. China sets its heart on something, sets its mind on something, and achieves it because it does. This is what the society we want first, and then it goes well. And the economy is merely the thing that says that measures the health of the society, not the god that we shall burn the society to achieve. Unlike the Anglosphere, particularly the UK. So anyway, there we are. Interesting stuff. Nice bit of news there. So we have to start talking about open access. We have to start. Hello, it's me in the bottom corner. We have to start by asking, what is that? What is open access operations? My editor was rightly going, what is that? And I was like, well, it's tricky to summarize in fewer words. Let's put it that way. Open access. Well, in the UK, firstly, there's a document, the House of Commons library document. If you want to read that to give you a bit of background on open access operators, but it's fairly dry. It doesn't really give you much of the story and the context as to why they appeared. Open access operators in the UK, or in GB rather, are rail operators that sit outside of the passenger franchise system, other than Network Rail's trains and DRS, Direct Rail Services, which is the state-owned rail freight company, which obviously we need to reabsorb in GBR, by the way, and I hope there are plans to do that. So that's what they are. And firstly, freight is that. The freight companies are all open access companies. Eurostar is an open access. Heathrow Express, soon to hopefully die, is an open access. There's no point to Heathrow Express now, Crossrail here. It's just extremely expensive way to get in and out of the city, and it just adds pointless complexity. Just dispense with it. And Go-Op, which is some of the new options that have been put forward. I think they've confirmed one that's kind of the southwesty sort of rail service. I'm not going to be looking at these. I'm not going to be looking at these ones today, particularly because I'm focusing on the East Coast Mainline as the major congested rail artery that gives us a hint as to what might happen if we try and repeat this on the West Coast Mainline. But so we're going to put these to one side. These are all open access operations, though. The open access operations that I'm going to be talking about are Hull Trains, which arrived in 2000, Grand Central, currently operated by Arriva, Hull first, Lumo first, by the way, Grand Central by Arriva, which appeared in 2007, again on the East Coast Mainline, and Lumo, which appeared in 2021, so pretty recent Lumo as a proposition. These are the open access operators we're going to be thinking mostly about tonight. And they run services in amongst LNER services. They all run high-speed trains up and down the East Coast Mainline. Hull and Lumo now have the sort of standard 8OX kind of bimodal. Actually, I don't know. The Lumo ones might be electric only, actually, but they are the standard Hitachi 8300 model, the kind of the IT derivatives. Grand Central is still running a weird mixture of knackered DMUs that are long overdue, including the flaming delight that is the Atalantes, the 180s that love to just configurate themselves, and they're running a few Voyagers as well. So those are the open access operators that we're going to be talking about tonight. And you might then go, well, what's the whole deal with that? Why are they outside the franchising system? Well, there's part of a rare, admittedly, a rare moment where you have actual competition, ostensibly, being introduced on a railway line that competes with the incumbent franchised operator. And you might say, well, there's some value to that because it drives some competition against another private company. So it actually creates meaningful competition on the railways where otherwise there isn't any. Or does it? Well, we'll get there. So to the point, well, you know what? We'll hand over to First Group. How better to understand what the arguments in favour of open access operations are than seeing what First Group have to say about it. So, let's have a little look, shall we? So why open access is essential for a better railway moving forward together. This is a First Group document. Let's have a look, shall we? So here we are. There's the what is open access rail point here. Open access, hugely successful aspect of the rail industry over the last 25 years. Okay, marvellous. And we've got a load of remember, this is a pitch. It's very important to remember this document is a pitch. So here's a little map showing where they would like to. They're kind of like, look, we can put Lumos everywhere here, and won't it be marvelous? So okay, fine. I've got to be careful to be very fine. So we have the document here. Open access delivered huge improvements to the railway over the past 2 decades. Well, that's an unfalsifiable statement, so we'll kind of put that to one side. Rail reform is coming. It's vital open access is embraced and allowed to deliver more rather than being marginalised. Leading that delivery is our mission. Okay, so we could kind of put this to one side because this is kind of the pitch from the managing director of Fresh Rail at the time, Steve Montgomery. So here's a bit of history about open access. Okay, so so it's a bit of like, how does this happen? Here's some discussion about here's Hull Trains talking about what it did originally when it popped up in September 2000, running these things that I grew up with, the 170s, back and forth. So this is there we go. So there's a lot of spiel. They've said a lot of things here, but there's a lot of spiel here, and nothing, none of it particularly that we could pick up on, but fine. Okay, they give me a bit of timeline. So here's where we start getting some numbers. Open access operators deliver substantial economic benefits. Arup studies show that since Hull Trains launched in 2000, estimated up to 380 million worth of economic benefits have been realised, while on Lumo the benefits being calculated as at least 470 million. Those numbers, the counterfactual to that is that no trains are running to Hull. We're going to come back to Hull because I think it's really important. Hull Trains have been fantastic for Hull. I think and there's a lot to be said for that kind of nice region, that nice local identity. I like that. But all the claims about it requires the counterfactual of no long distance fast services to Hull, and the trouble with that is that I don't think it's realistic to say that there just wouldn't be long. If there wasn't Hull Trains, we would hope, and we'll come back to this point. It's difficult. I find it very difficult and not realistic to argue that within a year or two you'd have seen services being run by the incumbent operator, which wasn't LNER at the time. The incumbent operator running to Hull in its place. So so it's one of those bait and switch moments where it's like, these trains that are running, they've created all this economic benefit. It's like, well, yeah, the fact that trains are running has created all this economic benefit. The fact that they're open access operations, I think there's a reasonable point and we'll get to it later, that under the franchise model, the lack of responsiveness of the franchise model meant that only open access operators could be that sort of lean to create it, but actually it took years to get that into place through the RR's process as well. So I kind of don't think that holds up necessarily either. But there is there's stuff about all this sort of all these economic benefits that are being picked up on, all the job creation, all of it relies on a counterfactual of there would be no long distance service from Hull to London, which I don't think it's. I think that's difficult to. I think that's kind of a difficult case to really make kind of viably. So let's crack on. Let's see what else. So let's see. Lumo drives modal shift and promotes social mobility on the East Coast, and while Hull Trains delivers for previously underserved communities in Yorkshire. So we've kind of talked about the underserved communities bit. The driving modal shift is interesting. I want to pick up on this because it's absolutely the case that the presence of Lumo and generally the viability and success of the East Coast mainline has absolutely walloped the mode share of rail versus air. I believe rail is now above 50% market share on the between London and Edinburgh, which is terrific. Between London and Scotland on the East Coast mainline, that really is terrific. Again, though, the problem is that this is exposed. Like, you're running on routes that you would be LNER trains, and the charge comes back. Well, the fares are cheaper on Lumo, which is what drives that, brings people on. Absolutely. You don't get me started on fares, particularly all the weird reform that's been going on with fares on LNER recently. Fares absolutely could come down and would drive modal shift. That's absolutely the case. What would also drive modal shift, and we'll get to this a bit later, is reducing the complexity of the East Coast mainline, reducing the number of conflicting services, and then running more trains and running higher capacities and running longer trains in the path that you have, which Lumo only have a 5-car train, so they don't. So what drives modal shift is having bums on seats and having the seats to put the bums on. And I don't think it's legitimate to say that it's just because Lumo are running that mode share has happened. If those trains are being run by LNER, or if we had a more high density timetable, we would be seeing that modal shift anyway. So again, like, it is great that Lumo is driving that improved share for rail. That's terrific. It's a good thing. But as we'll talk about later, there are some challenges with the level at which that's at the expense of the overall railway service when taken in totality, when looked at in totality versus alternatives. So this is the next thing, is like, this is a bit of a puff thing about, we're going to pop open access everywhere. There's going to be open access. We're going to be running Lumos left, right, and centre. And we'll talk about why that makes me nervous shortly. But this is kind of a lot of stuff that's just really. There's nothing really particularly material in there for us to jump out. There's stuff about creation of jobs, but again, that would be the case if you had new depots for the trains that would be, you need to run the extra services anyway. So again, that doesn't necessarily stand up. Open access is an established model which already successfully operates across Europe. So discussions of open access operations in Europe we will get to by the end. We will tackle this claim by the end, and it is absolutely true that open access operations have pushed incumbent operators to do better in areas where I would say their service was lackadaisical. Italy is a very good example of this. In France, I'm not so convinced of the case, but certainly in Italy, we've seen improvements to the incumbent Frecciaroscia and Trenitalia services as a result of the presence of open access, Italo and others. That has driven improvements in passenger services, driven improvements in provision overall. But there is a key variable we will get to on that, but I will allude to it now, and that key variable is capacity. Italian high-speed rail infrastructure is severely underutilized, and therefore there is the capacity to run those extra trains without causing any headaches for anyone in terms of knocking out local services, as we see on the mixed traffic railway like GBs, or in terms of if you have a saturated intercity connection like some of the high-speed lines are in other parts of Europe. So, it can work where you have not got a saturated rail network. That's not addressed in what we can see here. So they are pointing out things that are true, but they're not addressing why that's able to happen, why that functions. And the next one's an interesting one. So the first was about the fact that the European model. The next one is about trains, building for the future, investing in new UK-built trains for passengers. Well, again, if you're running those other trains, with the incumbent running those other trains, then those other trains would be needed anyway. So, again, does this actually hang up as an argument? It's certainly true that investment is happening, but, and by the way, a reasonable argument is that it forced the hand of an inept and incompetent and extremely investment averse Labour government to have to, talk about some of that support that's happening up at Newton Aycliffe, where they, the manufacturing of trains. There's some nice crashworthiness structures kind of going on here. It's very interesting. Anyway, where that's happening. But again, like, if you're running those extra services, the trains, you need trains to run them, and we'll get to that's then. I think the viable argument here is, well, is that possible? Are we dynamic enough to start running services responsively, given how long it's taken to deal with the East Coast mainline timetable? Again, I'm shooting my own fox here and making the edit a nightmare for James. James is saying, you were going to talk about the layer. Why don't you talk about layer? Well, anyway, it's because my brain's dashing around all over the place. Anyway, so how can industry and government work in partnership to grow open access and the entire railway together? Well, that's an output, an objective, but it's not an outcome. What's the outcome? The outcome is... the outcome very strongly is we need more people to travel by train. And that requires us to tackle the challenges of people's perception of travelling by train. And complexity is a key pressure. Lack of seats is another. So here are a couple of points that First Group are pushing for with reform. So the first one here is protecting the ORR's independence as a robust regulator. Well, that the ORR becomes significantly... a lot of the ORR's functions become completely pointless under a GBR system, a properly vertically integrated railway. So, the next one, accelerate track access bids. To me, also the other thing about that is ORR's independence. Yeah, but the ORR is not the trouble with that conflict is that the ORR, and this has been covered by Green Signals a bit actually. The conflict between the ORR as we are independent regulator is that, well, it doesn't matter. The government should and should be willing to and will have the power to exercise its own policy objectives through GBR. Therefore, the ORR's independence would create conflict with that, or they just follow it, in which case their purpose is sort of, the specific. I'm not saying the whole ORR is pointless, but the rail regulator in terms of track access, etc., element becomes pointless. It becomes a challenge. Of course, freight, key factor in the relationship between freight and GBR, but that again doesn't need the ORR. It could be done by an internal body within GBR, because you have if freight, if the targets or the objectives for GBR are we want 25, 30, 40% mode share by rail of freight, then GBR has an interest in ensuring the balance is right between passenger and freight. So you can set the right objectives and incentives to get the right outcomes without needing the ORR to satisfy that purpose. Accelerate track access bids to meet market demand, deliver environmental benefits, and unlock investment. Well, that's kind of a moot. That's just saying do the get more open access operations running more quickly. Well, ensure open access is a key part of the railways bill. Well, obviously they'd ask for that, right? And then the last one is kind of an interesting one, which is learn from market liberalisation in Europe. 7 of the 10 busiest routes in Europe have competition against state operators. For more about market liberalisation in Europe, read my book, because the stories that we're told about market liberalisation in Europe are quite detached from the reality that we see. At best, the success of railways is agnostic to liberalisation, but there are key areas where liberalisation has caused quite a lot of harm. I talked earlier about open access not causing harm and being useful on certain corridors, but those corridors are not the busy ones. So I would strongly dispute the fact that you have competition against the state operators being what's caused the success. Arguably, you've written a sentence there. 7 of the 10 busiest routes in Europe have competition against state operators. This has led to more passenger demand. Is it not perhaps that there is high passenger demand anyway? So, yeah, I would... Again, this is a lot of, cart horse causation correlation stuff in this paragraph, which I would challenge. You can't put a paragraph like that without strong evidence that supports the claim of the liberalisation leading to it, because as we see in the UK, as we see, I'm afraid, across Europe, what we have is a trace upwards of rail demand, and then liberalisation kind of follows that. The change, the GB example is perfect, because you have this climb from the very early 90s of ridership, and it's so often said, well, there's privatisation happened, and look at that ridership climb. And firstly, well, no, because the rise started in the mid 80s. It's just that the graph you're showing invariably starts in 1990 or whatever. Secondly, why is it that ridership instantly, when nothing has changed, increases in 1990? In the early 90s, when most of the franchise operators aren't franchised, they're still controlled. They've just split it into individual operating units. So that doesn't make any sense. What you're describing is correlation with ridership increased at the same time as we decided to privatise the rail network. And that, I'm afraid, is pretty much the case across Europe as well. Correlation, not causation. And that's the report. So there's some interesting ways for us to look at the constructive argument, but you'll see there is no clincher. I think the strongest argument that we see in that document is about... and we'll get to later, is about the ineffectiveness of the previous operating model, the franchise model, to respond to change. But part of the challenge with that isn't, even today now, where we don't have a franchise system, the challenge with that is that the complexity of our mixed traffic railway is what requires that long consultation process, because we have an intensely mixed traffic railway. And the reason it takes a long time to unpick that and then update timetables, in the case of the East Coast Mainline, a very long time, is because we're trying to get so much out of a mixed traffic railway. And that is not, that complexity is not conducive to driving modal share, because driving modal shift towards rail, because you are hitting local services to prioritise long distance services. You have a complex mess of ticketing for passengers. Yeah, we'll get to all that. What problems do they cause? Right, so let's go through these sequentially, and I'll elaborate on the points I've already kind of alluded to so far. The first is the impact on provision, by which I mean not just capacity, but on local services, on the way that freight interacts with the railway. Open access causes problems. East Coast Mainline particularly, because you have this intense operation on the East Coast Mainline. You have a situation where the open access operators have a regulated, essentially fixed point through the timetable, that everything else has to kind of move around. Whereas if the open access operators, or those services being run currently by open access operators, were run by the incumbent, you could jiggle them around to optimize the timetable. You could do clever things like skipping, changing which service skips a stop, which ones call here, there, where you flight trains together, whereas that's not possible with the fixed point regulated open access operators. Now, I've talked about this in an article I wrote for Rail Review and Rail Magazine last year, which got a few people's goat up. In it, I talk about the need to slow down the East Coast Main Line, firstly. So by that, I don't necessarily mean reducing speeds from 125 miles an hour down, but I do mean increasing the frequency of stops on services. So fewer non-stop services, more stopping services. The acceleration of the Azumas allows you to do that without much of a hit to timetables and overall full length journey times. Doing so would give you, well, first it would cause you challenges at King's Cross because there's only so many platforms, but unpicking that somewhat, you'd have the ability to look at better local provision, because the challenge you've got here on the East Coast Main Line with the mixed traffic is that we've had, for 5 years nearly, no new timetable on the East Coast Main Line. So that's billions of pounds of capital investment on the East Coast Main Line have basically not been exploited because it's been so challenging for the system operator within Network Rail and for all the other parties and stakeholders, all of them, including open access, to get a timetable that works for local people as well as the long distance travellers. And there have this timetable still has compromises in it. It's an incredible. It's an incredible piece of craft, this new timetable. The December 2025 timetable will be spectacular. But there are losers. It's not, as you see in local news, there are winners, but there are also losers. And local services are the ones that generally have been hit by this challenge of having, and this is why I advocate for Highspeed rail so vigorously, because you get, two railways for the price of one. This is a key challenge with open access is causing those challenges to the timetable, minimizing the capacity that you can therefore create, and therefore limiting the shift away from cars and rail and air. Sorry, and the cars issue is the local services are the ones that drive a lot of the modal shift away from cars. The long distance, particularly long, point to point from Edinburgh to London, that's air. But the cars are where a lot of the carbon is, and those are where a lot of the people are. And so actually, it's the local services that are extremely important, even if you are managing to fill all the seats of your long distance services. So the sacrifice of local services might seem like a good idea from a revenue creation perspective on that small front. But actually, if we're wanting to maximize the shift of people away from polluting modes and improving safety on our roads, etc., and creating airport capacity, if you want to make that argument, although I don't, then actually you need to think about those local services as well, particularly on the approaches into London, but also, of course, the connections in Yorkshire, connections across across Lincolnshire, across the East Midlands, and the good grief, the approaches into Edinburgh as well. Serious challenges. Now, Jacobs did some work for LNER. I've done lots of redactions on this, particularly in terms of names, obviously. Jacobs did some work for LNER, looking at the impact of open access operations on LNER's revenue over a 10-year period, and also retroactively over the period of time that open access operations have existed in competition with incumbent services, not just LNER, but incumbent services. If it's for LNER, basically it's for government. Government had commissioned it. LNER, part of DOHL or DFT Rail. I can't remember what it's called now. DFT operations. Anyway, basically the state held railway operator, and so government is kind of inquiring about this to get an understanding, and rightly so. They should do that. What is a shame is that this hasn't been published as something for us to understand what the context is, because fundamentally what rail service is running on a railway that is ours is a matter of democratic accountability, and for services to be randomly running on those lines, then we should understand what the implications are on us, on our services, and on the things that we subsidise as taxpayers and as fare payers. So it's not right that analysis like this is done behind the scenes without being public about it. And as I always say, the railway is a driver of public of enterprise, whether it's public or private, not by you having private bits of the railway, but by suppliers to it, for sure, but critically by making the country work and meaning businesses can function better in the country because people can move around, goods can move around, things of this nature. So, yeah, there is not some inherent need to have private rail operators. There's not some inherent need to that. Just as is the same for healthcare. Actually, having a good state public healthcare system makes the country work better. It's just that there are profits to be made by getting involved in those public services, and the evidence is very much that the involvement of the private sector does not help that sector. And in lots of bits of the railways where you see the same thing. Outsourcing is a key example of that when it comes to certainly things like facilities management and other points. So, to reduce my face, the memo, impacting on revenue. Let's have a look, shall we? So the summary of findings is at the start here that LNER's revenue would have been at least £562 million higher if open access operators had not operated services on the East Coast mainline, and in the next decade it will be £1.1 billion lower because of open access operations. Now, there's some things we need to unpick with this, and we'll do so later, but there's a bit of introduction. Fine. We have some discussion of the technical approach. We go into impact on overall service level, which is interesting, and to be honest, gets into technicalities that are kind of a little beyond my head. Generalized journey time, I understand. That's related to travel change times as well as just the explicit journey time. So it's looking at impact on journey times, but others might have better idea of what these impacts are. Martha, if you're looking at this, you, for example, might be interested. But I don't think it makes a huge difference to the specifics of this. Don't time much into the kind of the picture that I'm trying to unpick here. So you've got a load of stuff about growth and elasticities, and you know what, that all relies on a counterfactual that isn't very good, as we'll talk about later, because I don't think this memo is particularly wonderful, frankly. I know it's making the argument in favour of open access, against open access, if you like, if you want to word it that way, but I actually think it has some shortcomings. There are shortcomings that go further in favour of not having open access operators, by the way, but there are shortcomings. So here's some bits that I've blanked out that hopefully make things a little bit less stressful for those involved. But basically you get the headline numbers of revenue versus revenue. The kind of the open access revenue and the revenue loss, and there's a bit of a difference between the two. You can see that this is essentially making the argument down here that open access has driven the creation of demand that would otherwise not have existed. Now, that's quite possibly true, but we'll unpick that in a minute. In a bit more detail. Similar sort of story here. What's interesting is the retention of 100% of revenue at Newcastle. The reason LNER retains more than 100% of revenue at Newcastle is that the revenue growth from charging higher fares is greater than the revenue loss from a less frequent train service. This does not extend to Edinburgh, as the difference between LNER and Lumo yields is much smaller than at Newcastle. It's kind of why I'm not... This is a little frustrating for me, is I don't care about... I have different interests. I don't care so much about revenue as I care about passenger growth. And the detail in passenger growth is not nearly as useful as the detail on... I'd be interested to know about what the impact on ridership is. But anyway, so they're looking at this. And this is where these kind of numbers have come from. And you've got the kind of the base case, and you've got some of the slightly different assumptions on what the impacts are on those numbers. But they're pretty large numbers of lost revenue. Yeah, these are big numbers. Let's put it this way. But I do want to draw attention to the limitations of this analysis, although I say that the limitations are in the opposite direction. The limitations here are this is a story of counterfactuals. For anyone who doesn't know, counterfactual is the timeline, the multiverse fracture that you have to analyze our real world against to come up with solutions. And counterfactuals are a natural part of academia. You make a hypothesis and you challenge it. The counterfactual here, I think, has some shortcomings. The first is, I essentially don't think it's a particularly viable counterfactual. It assumes LNER would run exactly the same train service without open access operators. So I'm going to read what they say here. In practice, there would be fewer timetable constraints. It's possible LNER's additional Newcastle London services would have begun already without open access. It's possible LNER would have different stopping patterns at some stations too. If the timetable were the same, then with less congestion on the network, it's likely there'd be some difference in operational performance, which would drive ridership increases as well. Of course, it doesn't talk about it doesn't talk about the fact that LNER could then be running more services than we see today. It doesn't talk about the potential for better local provision, which would then feed the long-distance services as well. The next one, our modelling of the impacts of changed fares assumes all passengers pay the same fare measured by yield in Lennon. That's one of the ticketing systems that we have. But this is, people pay different prices for the same journeys depending on blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this is a bit of a difference in the yield modelling. Fine. We've not accounted for split ticketing and understanding the size of travel markets. Yeah, okay, fine. We have assumed that there is sufficient capacity to accommodate open access passengers on LNER services, which, to be fair, that goes sort of a little bit against this kind of the criticism of open access, because capacity is a challenge. But again, Lumo runs shorter trains. Also, without Lumo, you kind of run a more dense timetable. They've also forecast in the future. We've assumed the character of travel markets does not change in the future. Remember, by 2035, we need to be getting close to doubling rail's capacity. So it's kind of the analysis again. It's kind of moot at this point. But so key headlines here is let me go big face and sort of say the headlines of this bit really that I want to summarize and why this analysis is kind of has challenges. There's no considered potential lost revenue from other services that a more complex timetable has pushed out. There's no consider of if LNER or what it used to be had operated these services or something, the open access services instead, or something kind of nominally similar. There's no consideration of those put off by over complex ticketing, multiple operators and so on. So the counterfactual is, it's the numbers could be higher, quite substantially higher. The extent to how much higher they are, I can't really quantify, but the numbers are already quite large. But I think it's interesting to just sort of point that out. So the last bit is a bit of a disclaimer. That's fine. We're not going to worry about that. So the next thing, the impact on simplicity, which I alluded to there, which I think is really important. The impact on simplicity. Well, essentially, this is a photograph of the tickets behind my head over. Where are they? Over here. Yeah, you can see the pile of them. And interestingly enough, entirely unplanned, valid only on Grand Central services. I want a simpler railway. We should have a simpler railway. We should have a simpler railway, and that comes to timetables, which are extremely complicated on a mixed traffic railway. We should have a simpler ticketing system, simpler way to buy tickets, simpler way to interact with the railway, a much more permeable access to trains, whether it's accessibility or whether it's ticket gates or what have you. And as I say, open access is a boundary against that. It increases complexity, and I just don't. This is not just ideological. It's a reflection of passenger need. They do want seats. They want cheaper fares. But those are things that are political choices not to happen. The reason fares are high is because government can put fares at that level in order to avoid public investment in the railways to expand capacity. If we expanded capacity, we would bring fares down. That's a natural consequence of improving capacity. You can reduce fares because you get more people, more bums and seats. So the complexity point or the losing simplicity point, I think, is a really important one. This isn't just a story of open access bad, though. I have said I want it to be as even-handed as I can be in this one, because I know that I have people who are upset when I grump about open access operations for passengers. I think the real thing that we can reflect on in this instance, I think one of the really key ones is or still today, the inherent lack of responsiveness, particularly regional responsiveness, to demand for rail services. I think that's one thing that open access has shone a light on in the UK. Hull is a nice example of that. There is, in fact, you know what? Hull, lovely Hull. Here's Hull. Hull's an example of a city that was very much on the up and up, right? And, culminating in City of Culture, Hulture, which was a delight and a glory and a joy. I have a soft spot for Hull. I just like it. I like a city like that. It's just a fascinating city, maritime city, lots going on. Lots of bad choices made on the waterfront. Obviously need to get rid of the main road that goes through Hull. Just get rid of it entirely. You pave it over is one thing, but I argue just get rid of the thing altogether and let the traffic evaporate, and put all the goods on ro-ros. Anyway, Hull, city on the up and up, and rail is part of that story, and Hull Trains can rightly say it is part of that story, but again, other rail services ought to have been in that place, and I think the thing in favour of open access argument is that our franchise system was completely incapable of responding to that need. Just was not. Far too complex, far too lumbered, far too centralised, way too much centralised control. And this is what's really important, and the lessons we get from this, well, I'll talk about momentarily, because GBR and open access is the next kind of point to think about. And what we really need to understand, this is the letter that Heidi Alexander wrote about open access. And I've talked about this a few episodes ago, that it's quite good that she has reiterated her position that they have to really prove their need, their purpose and their value versus incumbent operations. And I think this is the crux of it, is that the responsiveness that open access has exposed as lacking in the network, in the system, needs to be reflected in what GBR can do, particularly in the way that it is controlled regionally. But you can't do much of that with a timetable that's so immensely complex and highly strung on a very, very intensively used mixed traffic railway. That's the challenge. So the arguments about open access versus incumbent fade into, they fade somewhat when you consider the impact on our railway of not building, on the East Coast Mainline particularly, not building HS2 to Leeds and linking it up is an enormous crippling effect on the East Coast Mainline. I cannot express the extent to which it's a massive hit to the potential places like Grantham that are just going to increasingly lose a viable service and therefore lose mode share against the alternatives. Really challenging. And what about the long-term future of open access, kind of globally? And really, what I'm talking about, kind of, is what we've got in Europe. So Flixtrain, Italo, and Regio. Actually, it's not. It's Czech, isn't it? So RegioJet, running all over the place, actually. But Austria, for example, these services have exploited the fact that the European rail network is, in some places, not everywhere, but in some places, quite underutilized, and therefore there is space to run extra trains, and why not? But, and I talk about this in the book, fairly soon the European rail network, as many others, are going to need to absorb an enormous amount of modal shift from modes of transport that are no longer viable: air, long-distance road, particularly long-distance road haulage for goods. That model will be broken imminently, whether it's the loss of intermodal canals in Panama and Suez, whether it is the fact that EVs are simply there is no viable solution for heavy goods vehicles that are fully electrified. That opens up the opportunity for rail to go, hiya, we're here, we can do that, we've done it before, and we will do it again. And what that means is no space. And basically, that's a good thing, because we don't want expensive, carbon-intensive infrastructure to be sat barely utilised. We want it to be busy. There's a balance, of course, and the UK GB is beyond that useful balance because we have no time to get onto our railway and maintain it, but relatively speaking, but the major access challenge is a story that's not talked about enough on our railways, and it's a side effect of a very intensively used railway as the rest of Europe rises up to that level of intensiveness. And there are plenty of corridors where that intensiveness exists now. Brussels Antwerp is a good example of an incredibly intensively used railway corridor. There are lots and lots of others. As everything else rises up to that point, as we drive more and more modal shift towards rail, the viability of the questions that I've talked about of open access on the East Coast Mainline will become true everywhere else as well. So the long-term existence of open access operators is far from guaranteed. I would say that we should be, depending on the way that is coordinated, in some cases open access is used as the sole rail operator for some regions, as opposed to the more conventional liberalised model. That, again, that becomes a discussion of what the local area wants, what the level of vertical integration needs to happen. Yes, the European Union is pushing on more liberalisation. No, it will not solve the problems that we need to be solving. And frankly, the big questions are major state capital investment. Rightly, governments would then have more of an interest in what is using those railways that they have invested so heavily in. So the long-term viability of open access as a commercial business, well, 10 years, sure, not going to see dramatic. Well, I'd like to see dramatic shifts, but certainly 10, 15 years, open access operators I will still have a place. But beyond that, there are no non-radical futures. And I suspect we'll see open access edged out for the same reasons that we're seeing problems on the East Coast Mainline. So there we have it. A summary of open access. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm fascinated to know what people think, whether I've been reasonably even-handed or whether I've been unfair. I'm keen to have, Martin, come on the show. I want you to address some of these points. I would love to have you address some of these points. Ultimately, yes, First Group are, keen on profits, and I am, but Martin, I strongly believe that you do care a lot about railways and about getting more people on railways, and so I would be genuinely interested to have you on and have that conversation. RailNet doesn't have to always be the sort of, us all agree with each other. We can have a, given that we probably agree on a substantial amount, let's have that conversation. It'd be very interesting to do that. You've said yourself in a letter to Rail Magazine that I have my views and that you're disappointed that they get published. But the reality is that not many people are challenging that. Challenging some of these conventional narratives about what is good for the railways versus what isn't good for the railways. And I ultimately what I want is more bums on seats, more goods in trains. And people say, "Oh, you're partisan." Well, no, I follow what is the right path to getting. There's the other challenge I used to get from fellow B2B journalists about when I rail industry publications was, you get too political. It's like, well, where do you draw your dotted line where you stop following evidence as to what the right answer is? I just do it to the point where I say what the right answer is in terms of the political outcomes in the country as well. And at the moment, they are not in the current government. They certainly weren't in the previous government. Are they with any other party in the country at this point? No, I don't think they are, actually, which is extremely depressing. But there are people working on it. So there is some hope on that front. That hope is not with the current Labour Party. Whether it's in a version of the Labour Party in the future, I extremely doubt it. Again, no non-radical futures. We are going to have some serious things to think about in the next 15, 20 years that are going to keep us very busy, if not before, frankly. So that's interesting. Anyway, all of that waffle aside, the usual outro stuff. This is available in all good podcasting platforms. Thank you so much for joining and listening. If you have, you will get a nice clipped, edited version that'll be much tidier than my wafflings. The usual plugs, GarethDennis.co.uk/merch for the merchandise. Hello to the chat, GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord, where the chat continues to ad infinitum. And of course, patreon.com/GarethDennis. If you subscribe at the £5 and above level, you will get extra goodies from the next month onwards. I will start building up what the bonus rail natter is going to look like as I start expanding what I do. It is coming. It is coming. I just need to have time to sit down and think about it. So there's all sorts of things that you will get. You'll get Q&A sessions. You will get the chance to ask me questions that, rather than me giving a quick end of episode quickfire answer, I might do longer answers. So you will ask a question, I'll give a detailed answer, potentially including graphics or even worked up maps and railway options. So fun of that. Also, you get How the Rails Will Fix the Future, the audiobook, for free. So lots of fun bonus stuff if you subscribe on Patreon. If you're subscribing less than £5, you still get some stuff. You're still in the credits. You get the Discord channel access. You get discount on the merchandise. And you get a warm, fuzzy feeling to putting your name against me and what I do and supporting me. Or rather, not supporting me, because I don't take any of the Patreon money. It all goes on the stuff that runs the show, but that's fine. That's the point. Again, a plug. Wednesday the 4th of June, Wednesday the 10th of September. Please book ahead to go to these events. They're going to be fun. They're going to be like mini rail natters. One's going to be about the history. One's going to be about the future. I'm super excited about them. They're going to be a lot of fun. The Wednesday the 4th of June one is coming up soon. Please book your tickets to that. It's on the website. So you can find the link on that tab there, hopetowndarlington.co.uk/what's-on/ you can just Google Hopetown Darlington Gareth Dennis, and you'll get this page showing my mug and what's happening and what the two talks are going to be covering, and you can book there. Please do that. Next week, we're talking about more plans. Yes, we are talking about this new plan that popped up, Liverpool and Manchester. So kind of related to the Yorkshire one, actually, connecting the Northwest to drive national prosperity. So it's going to be interesting what they're called, the backbone of this northern arc that keeps getting mentioned. Who knows what that is? But we're going to have a look through this report. I'm interested to see what it says. And we'll, of course, give it a good, a series of clip ratings to see what we think. Oh, well, that was exciting, wasn't it? Without further ado, there's no questions because this is a pre-record, but I hope that was interesting. I hope that was reasonably fair. Shout at me if you disagree or if you agree or otherwise. And first group, you can't do it again. I just. I like my job and I care very greatly about it, and I care very greatly about railways. So, yeah. But this is important. I think it's an important conversation which has not got enough data to ensure that the conversation is vibrant, healthy, and accurate. Cheerio!